So normally we think that knowledge is a pretty simple thing. We see things and we believe they exist, and things we move around in the world and we make conclusions about what's going on, and we think they're pretty accurate. But philosophers are not so easily convinced by these things, as we have already seen from Plato. And so, for Plato, we can only have knowledge of the forms, and knowledge is a success word for most philosophers, which means it implies truth. And for Plato, there's only truth about the forms because only the forms are eternal. Not all philosophers believe this, of course. In fact, most of them don't. But most of them have some kind of view of truth or view of knowledge that involves the idea that things have to be true, that you believe in order for it to be knowledge, otherwise it doesn't end up counting as knowledge. So if we say, like, I knew the door was closed, and then you find out you're wrong, you normally would say, well, I believed the door was closed, but I didn't really know it because it turns out I was wrong. We'll get into a bit more of that later. But you can kind of see then why philosophers, used to really question the idea of whether we can have knowledge. So the academic skeptics, who were a group of people that is sort of a school that was formed by Plato, they really believed that knowledge was impossible. Now, they didn't necessarily think that you couldn't move around in the world, and you couldn't sort of have true beliefs, let's say, about things, but they thought that the kind of knowledge that Plato had talked about was really impossible. And later on, this led to an even stronger kind of skepticism called Pyrrhonian skepticism, that was named after this guy named Pyrrhonius, and you can read more about that in the book. This is an even stronger form of skepticism because they not only thought that knowledge was impossible, but they wouldn't judge anything at all. So they would not make any judgments about whether they existed, for example, or whether plants existed, or whether anything they saw was actually real. This is a very strange way to go about the world, but this is what they did. So they would say things like, perhaps it's possible, maybe, and they would trust custom or treat custom and things like that as things that they could do in order to perhaps keep themselves alive, right? I mean, you have to eat, so you have to believe you're hungry, but maybe you don't have to. Maybe you can just follow that without really believing it, in a sense. And that's what they tried to do, which is kind of strange. Much, much later, skepticism came back into fashion. It kind of fell out of fashion for a long time with science, and just philosophy going in and out of fashion and so on. But when Descartes came along, he kind of popularized the view again, not that it completely disappeared before then. But he really didn't want to be a skeptic. Descartes became famous for skepticism, but he wanted to use skepticism to build a foundation of knowledge. And how he thought he could do this is that he wanted these infallible foundational beliefs. So he thought, well, let's throw out everything that we're not sure about. And part of the reason why he became so famous and people continue to read him is because of the sort of interesting way that he did that. He said, look, you don't know that you're not dreaming any particular moment. You can't possibly know that you're awake right now. He didn't have to say that it was true that you're dreaming all the time, or that, like, he really thought you could be dreaming. He only had to say that you didn't know. And because if you don't know, then you can't really trust your senses, is his point. So he said, okay, based on the fact that I can't know that I'm not dreaming right now, I'm going to throw away all the beliefs that come out of my senses. And again, this goes back to the idea that, which he had and he got from the skeptics, that to know something, you can't doubt it at all. So, going back to Plato again, Plato kind of started this idea of knowledge as, we call it usually justified to belief. So, if you know something, you have to believe it, kind of obviously, right? It must be true, and that's the idea of knowledge being a success word. Also, you must be justified in believing P, whatever P is, the statement. So if you believe there's a cat in front of you, you have to be justified in believing that, and in order for you to have knowledge of it. Plato didn't talk about justification quite, but he kind of talked about this idea of reason or something like that. So for Descartes, his belief about justification was very strict. So he thought you weren't justified in believing something unless you really couldn't doubt it at all. And so based on this, then, we can't know that we're not dreaming, so our perceptual beliefs are unreliable. Why? Because when you're dreaming, you see stuff that's not there. But he wanted to eliminate all beliefs that you could possibly doubt, right? And so dream skepticism left certain beliefs in place. For example, those based on mathematics, perhaps memories, things like that. But mostly it was things that you don't get through perception, but we still think we know. So then he said, well, okay, are those things indubitable or not? And he argued that they weren't, based on this other sort of thought experiment, which was the evil demon. So this is sort of like a god, though he didn't want to use the word god because he didn't want to get in trouble with the church. But the evil demon has to be as powerful as a god because it has to be able to fool you not only about your perceptions, but more importantly about the things that you think. That you think you know based not on perceptions, say the meanings of words, say mathematics, things like that. So the evil demon, we can't know, just like we can't know we're not dreaming, we can't know that we're not being fooled constantly by an evil demon. So this got him to doubt many other things that the dream argument didn't really touch, right? Because if you're dreaming, you kind of still can know that 2 + 2 = 4, because it's not something that's coming through your perception, so it's something that you're not going to necessarily dream about, probably. You could argue against that, but in any case, so the demon is supposed to be able to fool us about more than a dream could. And that's why he came up with this as well. So now it seems like there's not a lot left. We're now doubting our perceptions, and we're also doubting the things that we think we know through reasoning. So what is left? Maybe even memories, right? The demon can fool you about anything, even the things that are in your mind. So seems like that Descartes has painted himself into a corner. But he concludes that the demon can't fool him one thing, and that's his own existence, because he has to exist in order to doubt, and in order for the demon to fool him, he has to exist. So we can know exactly one thing, and that's our existence. What he wants to do with this, of course, is to build a whole foundation of knowledge off it. Whether he can do that or not is a separate question, and we won't get into that too much here. He probably couldn't, but modern let's say anti-skeptics took a different tact and said, look, we're not going to try to do what Descartes did. We're not going to try to build a foundation of knowledge based on our own existence. It's kind of silly. Instead, what we want to do is shift the burden of proof to the skeptic. So G.E. Moore in the 1920s said, look, he went to supposedly he went to a conference or something, in a lecture, and held up his hands and said, look, you as a skeptic have to convince me that I'm wrong in believing that I have hands, not the other way around. Because this is a common sense belief, everybody believes it, so really the burden of the proof is on the skeptic, not on me. You need to tell me why I should not believe this. Bertrand Russell took a different tact and said, look, The simplest explanation is usually the best. This is called Occam's razor sometimes. And he said it's simpler to assume that the world exists than to believe this crazy skeptical story about a demon or whatever. Or any kind of skeptical story you want to come up with is going to be more complicated than simply the idea that I have hands or whatever, or that the world exists and that we can have knowledge of it. It's just going to be easier. And so that was the idea of shifting the burden of proof onto the skeptic and away from anybody who wants to believe anything sort of normal. So we'll talk more about knowledge in the next part.